March 19, 1944. Beneath the frozen soil of the Belgian borderlands, 30 meters below a seemingly impenetrable German fortress, a man named Thomas Griffiths pressed his ear against the clay wall and listened to the rhythm of enemy footsteps above. The former Welsh coal miner, now a sapper in the British Royal Engineers, had spent 6 months tunneling toward this exact position, moving earth one silent handful at a time. The German garrison commander, Oberst Friedrich Weber, sat in his reinforced command bunker that same morning, reviewing intelligence reports that assured him no Allied force could possibly breach his position. He believed his fortress, built into solid rock with walls 3 meters thick, was the most secure point along the entire defensive line. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What neither Weber nor his 1,000 soldiers knew was that their greatest vulnerability had nothing to do with the strength of their walls or the power of Allied artillery. Their fate had been sealed not by military genius or technological superiority, but by the quiet expertise of a man who had spent 20 years of his life learning to read stone, earth, and silence in the coal mines of South Wales. Thomas Griffiths was 41 years old when he enlisted in 1942. He had started working in the Rhondda Valley mines at age 14, following his father and grandfather into the dark tunnels that snaked beneath the Welsh countryside. By the time the conflict began, Thomas had logged over 27 years underground, developing an almost supernatural ability to sense structural weaknesses, predict cave-ins, and move through confined spaces with minimal sound. These skills seemed irrelevant to modern industrialized conflict until a Royal Engineers recruitment officer, Captain Edmund Price, visited the mining communities looking for experienced tunnelers. Price had studied the siege operations of the previous global conflict and understood that underground warfare remained devastatingly effective against fortified positions. He needed men who could work in absolute darkness, who understood how different types of soil and rock transmitted sound, and who possessed the patience to spend months advancing just meters per day. Thomas fit every requirement perfectly. Within 3 weeks of enlistment, he found himself in a specialized training camp outside Dover, teaching regular soldiers techniques he had learned from decades of dangerous, delicate work beneath the earth. The fortress at Haut-Bourdin had been constructed by German military engineers over 18 months, beginning in late 1942. Built into a natural limestone ridge overlooking a crucial supply route, the position featured interconnected bunkers, ammunition storage facilities carved into solid rock, and observation posts that provided clear sightlines for kilometers in every direction. The garrison numbered exactly 1,043 men, including infantry, artillery crews, and support personnel. Intelligence estimates suggested that a conventional assault would require at least 4 divisions and result in catastrophic casualties, possibly exceeding 10,000 men. Allied command decided on an alternative approach. In September 1943, Captain Price received authorization to begin tunneling operations. The plan called for a shaft to be sunk 500 meters behind Allied lines, then a horizontal tunnel, extending 780 meters toward the fortress foundation. The final section would branch into multiple chambers directly beneath the German position, where explosive charges totaling 8,000 kilograms would be placed. The operation received the code name Pickaxe, a sardonic reference to the humble tool that would accomplish what artillery could not. Thomas led a team of 12 tunnelers, all former miners from Wales, Scotland, and northern England. Each man had spent at least 15 years working underground. They understood implicitly the language of creaking timbers, shifting earth, and dangerous gases that could accumulate in unventilated spaces. The youngest member, Robert MacLeod from Glasgow, was 33 and had survived 2 mine collapses. The oldest, William Hughes, was 56 and could identify 9 different types of clay by touch alone in complete darkness. The initial shaft descended through relatively soft soil, reaching the required depth in just under 3 weeks. Then the real work began. The horizontal tunnel needed to maintain precise direction while avoiding underground water sources, unstable geology, and most critically, detection by German listening posts. Thomas implemented techniques he had developed during his mining career. The team worked in absolute silence, using specially padded tools and moving excavated earth in cloth bags that produced no metallic sounds. Communication happened through prearranged hand signals, visible only by the dim light of shielded lanterns. Progress averaged 3 meters per day through the autumn and winter of 1943. Every handful of earth removed had to be carefully examined for changes in composition that might indicate proximity to German countermining operations or unstable ground. Thomas developed a rotation system where each man worked for exactly 45 minutes, then rested for 90 minutes. This maintained maximum alertness and minimized the risk of mistakes caused by fatigue or oxygen deprivation in the poorly ventilated tunnel. Above ground, Oberst Weber received regular reports about Allied activity behind their lines. German intelligence had detected the initial shaft construction in September, but concluded it was probably for a forward observation post or communication bunker. The idea that anyone would attempt to tunnel nearly 800 meters through mixed soil and rock seemed absurd. Weber had read historical accounts of mining operations from the previous conflict, but those had involved much shorter distances and softer chalk geology. His position sat partially on limestone, which he believed made tunneling virtually impossible with hand tools. What Weber did not understand was that Thomas Griffiths had spent years working the hardest coal seams in Wales, where anthracite deposits mixed with shale and limestone created conditions that destroyed conventional mining equipment. Thomas had learned to identify microscopic fissures in rock faces, places where a precisely angled chisel stroke could fracture large sections without noise or excessive effort. He taught these techniques to his team, transforming what should have been impossible into merely extremely difficult. By January 1944, the tunnel had advanced 520 meters. The team encountered their first major obstacle when William Hughes detected a significant underground water source directly in their path. Conventional engineering would have required either bypassing the water through a deeper route or installing pumping equipment, both of which would have created noise and delayed progress for weeks. Thomas proposed a different solution based on his mining experience. The team would continue forward, but angle the tunnel floor upward at a slight gradient, allowing water to drain back toward the entrance shaft while maintaining the horizontal path toward the target. The technique worked, but required extraordinary precision. For 6 weeks, the tunnelers advanced through saturated clay that threatened to collapse behind them with every stroke. They installed temporary supports every half meter, using timber props wrapped in burlap to prevent creaking. Robert McLeod, working the forward position during a shift in mid-February, suddenly froze and signaled for Thomas to join him. Pressing his ear against the tunnel face, Thomas could hear distinct sounds, boots on wooden flooring, muffled voices speaking German, the metallic clank of equipment being moved. They had reached the outer perimeter of the fortress basement level. From this point forward, absolute silence became not just important but essential to survival. German listening posts above them operated continuously, staffed by soldiers trained to detect underground activity through sensitive equipment and experienced ears. Thomas calculated they were still 43 meters from their target position, but those final meters would need to be excavated one painful handful at a time, during periods when German activity above created enough ambient noise to mask their work. The team adapted to a new schedule. They worked only during specific hours: early morning when soldiers were moving to duty stations, midday when supply vehicles arrived, and evening when shifts changed. During these windows, the fortress generated enough sound to cover their careful excavations. During quiet periods, the tunnelers remained absolutely motionless, sometimes for 6 or 7 hours at a stretch, lying in cramped darkness with only their thoughts for company. Robert McLeod later wrote in his diary about those weeks of enforced silence, describing how he learned to distinguish between different German soldiers by their footstep patterns. One man, probably an officer, walked with a slight limp. Another had a habit of whistling the same melody every time he passed overhead. A third shuffled his feet, suggesting either fatigue or poor-fitting boots. These tiny human details, observed through meters of earth and stone, created an odd intimacy with men who would soon face death because of the tunnel being dug beneath them. Thomas struggled with his own thoughts during the silent periods. He had never considered himself a violent man. His entire career had been dedicated to extracting resources from the earth to fuel industry and warm homes. Now he was applying that same expertise to a purpose that would bury hundreds of human beings alive beneath tons of collapsing rock and concrete. He tried to frame it in terms of military necessity, of saving Allied lives that would be lost in a conventional assault. But during the long hours of enforced stillness, listening to German soldiers walking, talking, and living their lives just meters above him, the moral weight pressed down like the earth surrounding their tunnel. March 5th marked a breakthrough moment. The tunnel reached a position directly beneath the fortress' central bunker, where intelligence suggested ammunition and supplies were stored. Captain Price, making one of his rare visits to the forward tunnel section, consulted with Thomas about the final phase. They needed to create multiple side chambers where explosive charges would be distributed for maximum structural effect. The chambers needed to be large enough to hold substantial amounts of explosives, but excavated so carefully that no sound or vibration would alert the garrison. Thomas proposed using a technique he had learned from a mining disaster 20 years earlier. A cave-in at the Senkenid colliery had taught him how certain rock formations, when carefully scored along natural fracture lines, would break apart almost silently. He could identify these lines by running his fingers over the surface, feeling for microscopic changes in texture, invisible to the eye. Over the next 10 days, working entirely by touch in complete darkness, Thomas and his team excavated 4 chambers, each roughly 2 meters in diameter, positioned at strategic points beneath the fortress foundation. Above them, Oberst Weber dealt with increasingly concerning intelligence reports. Allied forces had been massing behind their lines for weeks. Reconnaissance suggested a major offensive was being planned, possibly targeting his sector. Weber reinforced his garrison with an additional company, bringing the total to 1,207 men. He ordered ammunition stockpiles increased and had engineers inspect the fortress walls for any signs of structural weakness. Everything checked perfectly. The position remained impregnable. On March 12th, Royal Engineers explosive specialists began moving charges into the tunnel system. Each charge consisted of amatol, a mixture chosen specifically for its stability and explosive power. The total amount placed in the 4 chambers reached 8,300 kilograms, slightly more than the original plan called for. Captain Price had calculated that this quantity, detonated simultaneously beneath the fortress foundation, would create a crater 40 meters wide and 15 meters deep. The limestone bedrock would fracture along natural plains, and the fortress structures would collapse into the resulting void. The charges were connected through a web of detonation cord that ran back through the entire length of the tunnel to a firing position 500 meters behind Allied lines. Multiple redundant firing systems were installed in case primary detonators failed. The operation was scheduled for March 19th at 0500 hours, coordinating with a diversionary artillery barrage that would mask the explosion and prevent immediate German understanding of what had occurred. Thomas made his final trip into the tunnel on March 18th. He had argued against going, knowing that his expertise was no longer needed for the detonation phase. But Captain Price understood the psychological importance of the gesture. Thomas needed to see what he had built, to confront the reality of what would happen. He crawled through the narrow passage one last time, running his hand along walls he had excavated handful by handful over 6 months of exhausting labor. When he reached the forward chamber, he could hear German voices clearly through the thin layer of rock that now separated the explosives from their target. Someone was laughing. Another voice was singing quietly. Normal human beings going about their evening routines, unaware that tomorrow morning they would be underground in a very different sense. The night passed slowly for both sides. In the German fortress, soldiers rotated through watch schedules as they had for months. Oberst Weber worked late in his office, reviewing defensive plans and writing letters to be sent to regional command. He felt satisfied with his preparations. Whatever the Allied forces had planned, his fortress would hold. In the Allied tunneling camp, Thomas sat outside the entrance shaft, unable to sleep. Robert MacLeod joined him around midnight and they shared a thermos of tea without speaking much. What was there to say? They had done their job with extraordinary skill. Tomorrow would prove whether it had been enough. At 0400 hours on March 19th, Allied artillery units began their diversionary barrage, targeting German positions 2 kilometers north of the fortress. The sound rolled across the landscape like continuous thunder. Inside the fortress, soldiers moved to battle stations, assuming this was the prelude to the expected assault. Ammunition handlers began moving shells from storage to gun positions. Officers checked communication lines and prepared situation reports. Everyone was focused outward, toward the obvious threat, not downward toward the silent danger that had grown beneath their feet for half a year. At 0457, Captain Price gave the order. The firing officer, Sergeant James Walsh from Cardiff, inserted the detonator key and turned it. Electric current raced through wire that ran 500 meters underground, through the main tunnel and into the 4 carefully excavated chambers. 8,300 kilograms of amatol detonated simultaneously, releasing energy equivalent to thousands of artillery shells in a single concentrated instant. The explosion propagated through limestone bedrock at thousands of meters per second. The rock, already stressed by the weight of fortress structures above, fractured along the natural plains Thomas had identified. The fortress central bunker, ammunition storage facilities, and 3 defensive positions dropped vertically as the ground beneath them simply ceased to exist. The crater that formed measured 41 meters wide and 17 meters deep, slightly larger than predicted. Dust and debris erupted skyward, visible from Allied observation posts 5 kilometers away. The German garrison experienced catastrophic disorientation. Over 800 men were in the central fortress complex when the ground collapsed. Most found themselves buried under tons of earth and shattered concrete, trapped in darkness with no understanding of what had happened. The survivors, primarily those in outlying positions, assumed they were under the heaviest artillery barrage in history. Panic spread as soldiers realized their supposedly impregnable fortress had been destroyed by something they could not see, hear, or comprehend until it was too late. Allied forces advanced toward the position at 0515, expecting to face fierce resistance from surviving defenders. Instead, they found chaos. German soldiers were emerging from secondary positions with hands raised, too shocked to mount organized resistance. Oberst Weber, who had been in a forward observation post when the explosion occurred, stood at the crater's edge, staring into the massive hole that had swallowed most of his command. He requested immediate surrender terms at 0600 hours, unable to justify continued fighting when his defensive position had been erased from existence. The rescue operations that followed were complex and heartbreaking. Allied engineers, ironically including some of Thomas's tunneling team, worked alongside German survivors to dig out buried soldiers. They recovered 273 men alive over the next 48 hours, many with injuries but survivable. The final count showed 831 men had been buried by the collapse. Of these, approximately 600 were recovered deceased, victims not of the explosion itself, but of suffocation and crushing injuries in the aftermath. Thomas participated in the rescue efforts, despite not being required to do so. He used his mining expertise to identify stable approaches to collapsed spaces and advised on safe excavation techniques. Several survivors owed their lives to his ability to predict where air pockets might have formed. One German soldier, pulled from a void after 31 hours of burial, was told afterward that a Welsh coal miner had been responsible both for the disaster and his rescue. The soldier, whose name was recorded as Friedrich Müller, reportedly said nothing for several minutes, then asked to meet Thomas. Their conversation, conducted through a translator, lasted only a few minutes. Müller simply wanted to understand how such a thing was possible. Thomas explained his background, the techniques used, the 6 months of silent work. Müller nodded slowly, then said something the translator rendered as, "I worked in a coal mine before the conflict. I should have known to listen for you." The Haut-Bourdin fortress operation became a classified success for Allied forces. The technique was too valuable to publicize while the conflict continued. Similar tunneling operations were planned for other fortified positions, though none matched the scale or devastating effectiveness of Thomas's work. Captain Price received a Distinguished Service Order for conceiving and managing the operation. Thomas Griffiths received a military medal for exceptional courage and skill in the field, presented in a quiet ceremony with no public announcement. After the conflict ended, Thomas returned to Wales but never went back to mining. He had spent too many months underground already, and the memories of those 6 months beneath Haut-Bourdin had changed something fundamental in how he related to enclosed spaces. He took a job as a safety inspector for mining operations, using his expertise to prevent the kind of collapses he had deliberately engineered during the conflict. He spoke rarely about his military service, and when he did, he focused on the technical challenges rather than the human cost. Robert MacLeod wrote a memoir in 1962 that included a chapter on the tunneling operation, though names and specific locations were changed to maintain operational security even decades later. In it, he reflected on the strange duality of their work, how they had applied peaceful mining techniques to military purposes, how expertise meant to save lives in dangerous coal seams had been redirected toward taking them. He noted that Thomas never seemed to take pride in the operation's success, treating it instead as something that had been necessary but not worthy of celebration. Oberst Weber survived the conflict and returned to his pre-war profession as a civil engineer. In the 1950s, he published a technical paper on fortification design that included an anonymous analysis of what he called the Belgian incident. His conclusion was stark. No fixed fortification, regardless of how well designed or strongly built, could be considered secure if potential attackers possessed sufficient patience, expertise, and determination to work beneath it. The paper became required reading in military engineering courses throughout Europe. The crater at Haut-Bourdin remained visible for years after the conflict ended. Local residents initially avoided the area, treating it as a mass grave site. Eventually, the Belgian government oversaw a proper burial and memorial for those who had been recovered. The site became a small military cemetery, marking not just German casualties, but the broader tragedy of industrialized conflict that could turn peaceful expertise into instruments of devastation. Friedrich Müller, the German soldier Thomas had helped rescue, returned to mining after the conflict. He emigrated to America in 1948 and worked in Pennsylvania coal mines for 30 years. In 1976, he wrote a letter to the British War Office trying to locate Thomas Griffiths, wanting to thank him properly and perhaps understand better what had happened in those dark hours beneath the fortress. The War Office forwarded the letter, and Thomas responded. They exchanged several letters over the following years, discussing mining techniques, safety improvements, and the strange twist of fate that had connected them. Neither man mentioned the conflict itself very much. There was an unspoken understanding that they shared something, an intimacy with darkness and earth, and the thin line between life and death that existed underground, that transcended the historical circumstances that had brought them together. Thomas Griffiths passed away in 1983 at the age of 82. His obituary in the local Welsh newspaper mentioned his decades of mining work and his service during the conflict, but included no specific details about his role in the tunneling operation. His family donated his military medal to a mining museum in the Rhondda Valley, where it sits in a display case alongside his original coal mining tools. A small plaque notes that he received the medal for exceptional technical expertise in military engineering, but provides no further context. The broader lesson of the Haut-Bourdin operation entered military doctrine quietly but permanently. It demonstrated that technological superiority and massive fortifications could be undermined by patient application of specialized civilian expertise. The operation succeeded not because of revolutionary weapons or overwhelming force, but because someone understood how to read earth and stone, how to move silently through confined spaces, and how to apply decades of peaceful knowledge to military necessity. What makes Thomas Griffiths' story particularly powerful is not the scale of destruction he enabled, but the profound reluctance with which he approached his task and the humanity he maintained throughout. Unlike many military innovations that distance the implementer from the consequences, Thomas literally heard the daily lives of the men his work would affect. He knew their routines, recognized their voices, and understood them as human beings rather than abstract enemies. Yet he completed his mission with extraordinary professionalism because he believed it would ultimately save more lives than it would end. the technical achievement remains impressive even from a modern perspective. Tunneling 780 meters through mixed geology with hand tools in absolute silence, while maintaining precise direction and structural stability, would challenge contemporary engineers with modern equipment. Thomas and his team accomplished it using techniques developed in commercial coal mines, adapted with creativity, and maintained through months of exhausting physical and psychological pressure. The psychological dimension adds another layer of complexity. Modern military psychology recognizes the trauma that can result from close-quarters conflict, where participants can perceive their opponents as individuals rather than anonymous threats. Thomas experienced this for 6 months, developing an unwanted intimacy with men he knew would die because of his work. The fact that he then participated in rescue efforts, using his expertise to save some of those same men, speaks to a moral complexity that transcends simple narratives of military success or failure. The story also illuminates how conflict transforms civilian expertise into military capabilities. Thomas never intended to become a soldier. His skills were developed for peaceful purposes, meant to support his family and community through honest labor. The conflict created circumstances where those skills became militarily valuable, placing him in a position where his expertise could accomplish what conventional military force could not. This transformation, from coal miner to military engineer, from creating tunnels for industry to collapsing them for tactical advantage, reflects the broader way that total conflict mobilizes entire societies. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.